Hi, I bet most of you, at least once in your lifetime, thought, hey, my layout is so simple. Why it's that hard to make it in CSS, right? At least I did cursed so many times while creating a grid. So my name is Tomek Wytrębowicz. I'm from here, from Warsaw. I work for the Star Counter when we are trying to change the world, making an awesome application platform with the fastest database in the universe. But I came here to tell you about CSS Grid Layout. Most of you probably noticed the fact that even though it's a meet.js, my speech will be mostly about CSS. But you may consider it as how to create an extremely efficient JavaScript code to create adaptive grid layout in your responsive app. While as extremely efficient code, I mean no code at all. Also, I'm not going to advertise any kind of third-party grid framework in here. I will show you how you can create your own using pure CSS and just a few lines of code. So let's stick to the grid. Why do we even bother about the grid? So let's take a look at just on any web page or any standalone app you use daily, some old school pages, or even physical newspaper. All of them use grids. And why is it so? It's because that's the way human brain perceives the information. There's a school in design called Gestalt, which claims that we are seeking for some similarities, proximities, grouping, and things like that. But let's leave it for the neuroscientists and psychologists and think how we can create a grid layout in web. So some of you are probably old enough to remember how we did create grid layout in dark ages. So we use table. We put a table inside a table, then another table in that table, then put a spacer div here, non-breaking spaces there, and then we pray that it will look more or less the same in our friend's Netscape Navigator. But we all know that it mixes the concepts of layout and the content. It requires us to create lots of empty cells and gifs. But we shouldn't blame ourselves, right? The grid and the table are quite similar concepts, and at least it worked. So there was a huge movement in web to do tableless layouts, so to put everything to divs and use CSS. OK, so what do we have in CSS? We have position absolute. But what you can do with position absolute, we can separate the concerns, but we end up with the div soup, with the pixel perfect layout that we need to maintain by ourselves and just take the responsibility out of the browser. And it's quite hard to do responsive design in position absolute. So what we have left, we have floats, right? Some smart guys figured out that we can use float property, the one that you use to make an image being floated by text. So it sounds like a great tool to make a layout, right? So it gives us a huge job security, because for ages, you need a really experienced web developer that possesses the secret skill of using float property for layout to do anything in web. But we all know that it's hard to do. It's even harder to maintain. We also need a div soup, and we need those clear fixes everywhere. So what else we have? We have table layout from the CSS, right? We are separating the concerns, but in fact, we are cheating, because we end up with the same problems like with table tag, but we cannot do row spans and col spans. OK, so what's left? Recently, the Flexbox layout popped up, and it's pretty awesome. So if you are not aware of it, you definitely should try it. It's already cross-browser supported. It's easy to use, easy to maintain. It gives you a possibility to define how the elements in a row or in a column should behave, how they should stretch, how they should shrink, how they should adapt to the parent container, how they should be aligned within the container, and so on. But as I mentioned, they are single-dimensional, so it's hard to create a grid. You'll need to nest Flexbox inside a Flexbox. So again, you'll end up with div soup. And you cannot do row spans and col spans effectively. OK, so maybe let's then try CSS frameworks. There are hundreds of them. So there are smart guys somewhere that figured out our problems and fixed that for us. But in fact, it's cheating once again, because no matter which framework will use, the Bootstrap or, I don't know, Foundation, whatever, they're using the hacks that we mentioned before. Moreover, you'll need to learn yet another language of classes. So you'll need to know which class to use in which case and so on. And it's quite hard to maintain because once you find some bug or obstacle, it's hard to fix it by yourself in the framework, and usually you need to wait for the vendor to fix that. You're locking yourself with that vendor because if your project is mature enough, you're almost unable to change the framework. It's also hard to mix the features of two frameworks together. And for sure you will get an overhead of features that are within the framework, but you're not using it anywhere. So don't you think that we are going the wrong direction? We're trying to find new hacks for every problem. There should be an easier way, right? All we would like to do is to select an element and then display it as a grid, right? And the good news I have for you today is that it works. So there's a CSS Grid Layout spec done by W3C, and it's meant to solve all our problems. So without creating a div soup with semantic HTML, we can get a meaningful, easy-to-use CSS to create responsive apps without any need of third-party code or JavaScript magic on top of that. No dependencies, just a browser and your code. OK, so let's give it a try. So don't bother much about syntax. I will explain everything later. Right now, we have just a quite clean HTML, a container with a logo, header, navigation, or some content. And we can just say that it should be displayed like grid. Okay, it doesn't look awesome yet, but now we can specify some columns. Let's say we like to have one column with 5 ems and one fraction here. Then the grid templates rows. We can do also for rows and give 2 ems in here and one fraction there. And ta-da! We got a flexible grid with 3 lines of CSS and nothing changed in HTML. So finally, CSS and browser are aware of two-dimensional layout concepts. In two-dimensional in more human-readable way, not just X, Y, pixel properties, but something that we can deal with. So let's briefly go through those concepts. So as an example, we have a grid container with few grid items. On top of that, we have grid lines, which are the scaffold, the foundation of our grid. They're just the lines that are numbered from 1 above. Then we have grid tracks, which is a common name for rows and columns. So there are simply spaces between grid lines. Then we have grid cells, which are the intersections of grid tracks. So they are the atomic places in which we could place our items. And by composing a rectangular combination of those, so by spanning through those elements, we can create grid areas, which are more useful areas to put our content. Yeah, so thanks to that, we can finally do some code. And the code that's easy to deal with. So you've already seen that we can create a grid just by setting a display property. We can also use an inline grid, which will behave as you'd expect. So you'll get an inline element with the grid context inside. So yeah, we definitely do have separation of concerns because we didn't touch a thing in HTML. We can also, as you've seen in the previous example, in the first example, we can specify the track sizes. So we do so with the grid templates columns property. Then we can use any CSS unit that's available. So we can use, let's say, 3 ems for the first column, then 100 pixel for the second column, and the columns are created automatically. Then we can use percentages. And right now we have a quite cool new unit, which is called a fraction, which is in fact a fraction of a free space. So it means the browser in runtime on any render phase, we'll get the free space that's left after setting a fixed size columns, divided by 3 in that case, and put 2/3 in here and 1/3 in here. So we get a flexible thing. We can do exactly the same for rows. Like here. Then we can put the first element to be, oh, where's my card? 2 ems and 1 fraction here. We can also use an auto value, which is an intrinsic size of an element inside. So it will use the size of the grid items in this track. So in this case, it will be a size just of an A and D. We can also use a really useful expression, which is called min-max. So you can say that you would like it to be no less than 3 ems, and you would like it to be something around 1 fraction. So it is 1 fraction, but it cannot be shrink to any less than 3 ems. It's quite useful to use it, for example, with the min content value. So we cannot shrink it below the minimum size of the content. There's also a shorthand for those two, like usual in CSS. So instead of writing grid template columns and grid template rows, we can simply specify the grid and divide columns and rows by /, and it does exactly the same thing. It also plays well with the other languages when you have right to left orientation, and you can use also a regular CSS property for that, which is direction. Right to left. So the items are packed from right to left. Yeah, and I think that's one of the first times in CSS history when we can create a container using CSS. So we'll no longer need any wrappers in our markup, in our HTML, because by defining a grid cell or a grid track, you're defining a container in which your element will be put, and you can set the dimensions for this element using CSS only, without adding any class to your HTML. So we also don't need any specified in your markup in HTML any empty cells or things like that. You don't need to specify clear fixes for sure. Yeah, things like that. OK, we already seen how to size the tracks, so let's try to do something with the items themselves. So by default, the elements are packed in the DOM order, so as they were in the HTML3. But you can change this order, for example, using the order property that you probably may know from the Flexbox layout. So let's say that we would like the A to be on the first position, and you see that the A is on the last position, but it is because the order 1 is definitely greater than nothing for the others. But if you create an E that is ordered, it's also 1, but let's now move A to 2. Now we have E before A, right? Maybe order is not such an awesome feature like for a grid. It probably works well for the Flexbox, but for a grid we have another property which is called just grid, column, and grid row. So we can precisely set the position of the element in the grid. So you can set it should be in third column and in number 2. So the rows and columns are created automatically by the grid. And we can also make spanning elements. So we can say that E should be in column number 1 and should span number 1. Should span for 2 columns, or 3 columns, or 4 columns. OK, we don't have 4 columns. We can also specify it using grid lines. So we can say that this element should be from the grid line number 1 to grid line number 2, which means it will be in the first row. But we can say that it should be grid line number 3, number 4, and so on. Yeah, so it's pretty cool because right now we don't need, we can manipulate and reorder, resort, reorganize the elements in a grid without any HTML changes, without any JavaScript code. It plays well for the accessibility and SEO because your markup is already there from the very beginning, so all those tools can read it directly. You have row spans and col spans, like in regular table. And you're setting this position precisely, but you do not control it in runtime. So the browser will take care on the fact that this element should be in second row and second column, for example. OK, I don't know how about you, but I'm a math student with dyslexia. So the numbers are quite problematic to me, adding, subtracting, moving them around. So defining grid rows and tracks and spans and lines using numbers, it's quite hard for me. And luckily, CSS Grid solves also this problem. So you can name the grid line. And you can do it explicitly by putting those names in square bracket in between the grid track lengths. So it's quite convenient. We have grid line, grid track, grid line, grid track, and so on. So you can say that it should be left line. Then let's have middle line and the right line. So right now we can use those names instead of numbers. So we got it in here, and ta-da, it works as before. We can set it to be the right. It works. And if we will set it to 2, it's definitely something else. So I'm not cheating. You can also use multiple names for the same line. So you can set it to be a line of hero and a line of header. And you can use both names for this row, right? Oop. Or hero or 4, right? So your code becomes even easier to use, even easier to maintain. You don't need to apply such classes in your HTML, so you no longer need classes like bottom-centered or things like that. OK, if we can name lines, why can't we name the areas? So yeah, we can use a grid area property and give a name for the area in which the, for example, header element would be placed. Then how we join the areas with the grid. So that's the grid template areas property. Then we use then we use some kind of ASCII art to draw our table. So we can set that head should be in 2 columns like this. It works. We can then say that let the navigation be on the left side and the content be on the right side. And then let the navigation be in here and the footer be in here. So we got entire layout set up with single property in very, very readable way. So it's even easier to write it. Once again, we don't need to set those classes in HTML. And with the single property, we can control entire layout of our grid. So let's try to use it in some more advanced, responsive layout. Let's say we are making something Facebook-like. So we have a hero, a main navigation, sub-navigation, like this top one. Huge chunk of content and a footer. So we have media queries for the desktop layout and for the mobile layout. We also attach the elements to appropriate areas. So the hero is in the header, the nav is nav, sub-nav is sub-nav, content is main, and footer is foot. So we can build using grid template areas. We can now build a grid that have a header spanning on 2 columns, navigation on the side, the main navigation on the side, the sub-navigation on top, the content in the middle, and footer on the bottom. Then we set up some lengths for tracks, and we have flexible grid layout. OK, so let's now try to do something else for the mobile. So we would like to have also grid tempered areas for the mobile. So let's say we'd like to stack all the elements one on top of another. We have a head on top. Then we will have navigation. Then we will have sub-navigation, main content, and some footer. And right now we can just give some values to the tracks. Grid templates. We have one column, so let it use entire space. So let's say we'd like to have 3 Ms for hero, 2 Ms for the main navigation, auto for the sub-navigation, everything we have for the content, and auto for the footer. So right now, just with those, you don't need this one. Ah, shit, sorry, I put it in the wrong media query, I think. Yeah. I'll refresh that. Yep. So I'll build this in here. So with this single property and 2 media queries, I've created a quite adaptive grid layout for my app. OK, so do you really think you need a grid framework right now? If you really do, you can create our own. So let's say you would like to have 12-column grid layout. And let's use the grid as a class name. Then you can say you would like to have grid. Oh, first I need to say that it should be display as grid. Then use grid. Fraction, then 1 fraction, then 1 fraction. But I can do it easier way. I can set, OK, let's repeat 12 times the column of size 1 fraction. Ta-da! 12-column grid layout with with 2 properties, which is quite flexible. You can do an element that spans for 2 columns, also in a simple way, like grid. Grid column span 2, or span 3, or span 4. Right? So it looks pretty convenient, right? OK, we've seen lots of cool features, but the question is, can we use it on production? Yeah. Not quite yet, but it's not as bad as it seems, because in IE it works pretty stable, in fact. They support a quite old specification, because that's also a fun thing, because that was their intent to create it. Microsoft with web. So the implementation is pretty stable, but the syntax may need some renamings for the properties or things like that. And you need to prefix everything with MS. In Chromium, so in Chrome, Opera, and things like that, you'll need it's the latest spec implemented, but it's hidden behind the flag. So we need to go to the about flags and set it. In Firefox, it's also enabled behind the flag. In WebKit, it's enabled by default, but in Nightly's, and you need to prefix it. And WebKit does not necessarily mean Safari. But you have a polyfill, which is a good piece of code. So I think it's definitely a moment to start fiddling with, to start learning it. You can go to Igalia demos and examples. That's the company that's in fact implementing it across the browser. So that's a good thing, because there's a single team working across all the browser engines to implement the feature. So once we'll get it, it should be pretty consistent. And you can take part in making the future of the web by putting some issues for the W3C, or making browser tests, or taking part in workshops that are being held around Europe right now. So if you're interested in taking part in one in Poland or organize one in Poland, just please let me know. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks for that presentation, because I think everyone was waiting for this "can I use" screenshot. The question is, how about the support for SAS or less syntax?
Well, it's rather a question for the SAS or less, because it's the CSS, right? It's in the browser.
Yeah, but do you know if they already did it, if the SAS and less have the support for this?
Sorry, but I'm not aware of it.
All right.
I think you need to check it. So, but I think that, I don't. So I think the SAS should just put it to the CSS and let the browser to handle it. But I cannot answer this question, sorry.
Okay, anyone else? Oh.
Hi. Does it support transitions?
Yeah, that's a good question. From what I tested recently, the transitions for the resizing works, but the transitions for moving elements across the table is not yet supported. But I think I've seen an issue on the W3C on that, so they're at least aware of that problem, and I think they will implement in future version.
Hi. It was the presentation I was waiting for when coming here today, so thank you. Excellent.
Thanks.
And my question is, if you set, for example, mean height of the grid element, what happens if content is longer?
But by setting mean height of an element, you mean by the
there was something like
grid row? Or
row, yes, row. And
okay,
if
we
you set
can
it,
check that.
Okay.
So if you set it, for example, that, let's pick an easier way. Okay, so we have a header, right, which have, let's say it should be mean height 200, right? And you mean the mean 100 of the, okay, so in here, right, in grid row. Let's make it 1 px, right? So the grid the grid row is 1 pixel, but your elements overflows. But you can, if you would like, you can use min max in here to not allow such hiding. And you can also specify, because you can also use position absolute within the grid. One of your elements, grid items could be position absolute, and just then it's relating to the grid container. So you can put a model window absolutely positioned on top of everything. So such a overflowing is as available as in any other place in CSS. Okay, thank you very much.